'Cause we speak bold, ain't tripping on the haters. It could take freedom from a cold dead hands. We're locked and loaded for the last dance. 'Cause we're the new American gangsters, ready to die for this land.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. Brian Blem here, Director of Government Affairs and our wonderful attorney. I'm Shelby Bush with We the People USA Alliance. Thanks for joining us. Brian, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, I thought it was incredibly important. I don't think that we as a people, right, can understand exactly where we're at today and what we've been talking about unless we fully understand where we have been. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Right. As we talk a lot about States United and Stephen Ritter and all these government officials using their personal emails, right? But where does that fit in the greater scheme of things, right? Why is all of that taking place? And so, I thought it would be interesting sort of to go back to January 1961 and play a video from a former president who had some very deep concern about what had evolved in the United States. Right? You want to talk about anything before we get right into it?
No, I say let's just go.
Yeah.
Steve, can you put up video 1 for us, please? So this is Dwight Eisenhower, President Dwight Eisenhower, 1961.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. How to do this? 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
I like that. I mean, one of the key tenets I take from that is when he said only an informed and intelligent populace can make this, right?
Yes.
And so what do you make of what's been happening in the United States since 1961 when Dwight D. Eisenhower gave this speech? Do you think we went to sleep?
We absolutely went to sleep. Look, America as a whole barely even teaches civics anymore.
No.
So when we talk about an informed and diligent society, we've been far from that. I'd like to think that there was somewhat of a shakening or an awakening that occurred maybe around between 2008 and present day.
Right.
And I think more and more people are waking up. And
Mhm.
I think some of that should be credited to President Donald Trump and what he has done to break through mainstream media. But no, we have not been watching what our government has done, and it's continued to grow and grow and grow.
Right. Yeah. And so, just really quickly on that point, before I miss that point, I think a lot of it had to do with Donald Trump. I would not give Donald Trump all of the credit for that. What I would give credit for that is sort of the evolution of technology, right? And what's been happening with technology enables everyone, you, me, Steve, Chris, my lovely wife, to be a reporter, right? We all now have this technology where we can blast out stories to the entire world instantly, right? And so I think really what has changed and brought, helped bring someone like President Trump to the fore was the complete diffusion of the ability to provide information to others, right? We're no longer dependent on going home after work and watching 60 Minutes, or NBC or ABC or CBS. And that is why those dinosaurs are struggling, right?
Well, and I think the birth of social media
Hmm.
kind of started that as well.
Right.
Facebook was a huge breakthrough in interconnecting people for a long time until they
Right.
played the censorship game
Uh-huh.
and started shutting down a lot of free speech and social media. And I think when Twitter came along, it was another avenue for people to communicate, share
Right.
news stories, break through that mainstream media
Right.
and educate themselves. And then Elon has taken that, I think, to a whole nother
Yeah.
level. So,
Well, and that I think that was part of the problem was that the military industrial complex and the national security state, those people who do their bidding, realized that they could no longer control the narrative. And that's why we're going to talk about a lot of the things we're going to talk about tonight with the national security state and its involvement in our courts and our elections per se. But I want to go back a little bit more because I advertised this episode about President Trump being more like John F. Kennedy than any other president in the history of the United States. Would you agree with that assessment?
100%.
Yeah. But they both have been trying to do the same thing, aren't they? Haven't they?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, what did John F. K. do when he first came into office? What he wanted to do. I mean, John F. Kennedy's first year as president of the United States, right, was nothing but chaotic international foreign policy,
Right.
right? You have, and this is on the heels of Eisenhower, right, giving this huge speech saying, "Hey, we got to be careful because these people got a lot of money and they got a lot of power and they're very secretive." And
Well,
so,
let's let that sink in, right? We don't believe in any means since 1961 the size of government has shrunk, do we,
no,
Brian?
it's just grown, nothing but grown.
So if in 1961 the military industrial complex
Hmm.
spent more money
Right,
than the collective corporations in America
right.
combined earns on an
Hmm.
annual basis, I would imagine we're in that same boat. I
Yeah.
believe the government employs more people in the United States than any other corporations combined. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's the federal government has grown enormous, and then you also have to add the state, if you add the local, if you add like the United States Postal Service, right? They're not really government employees because it's a federal corporation as opposed to a government agency. And so sorry about that. We've had this huge growth of government in the United States. But one of the things, I mean, I, they tried to kill Trump.
Hmm.
They did kill Kennedy, right? And prior to the assassination of John F. Kennedy, right? We had the whole Bay of Pigs fiasco, right? You studied that in high school, didn't you?
Absolutely.
Right. And so John F. Kennedy refused to give air support, right? He told the CIA, "You want these Cuban rebels to go invade Cuba and take their country back? Let them. But I'm
Right.
not going to give them air support.
Well, and
We're not going to do it."
I don't know if anybody knows. I mean, some people will, but I don't know that everybody knows the background of that. And it might be
Hmm.
worthwhile to share, including the fact that the CIA tried to convince the president to create kind of a false flag. Do you
Right.
want to talk about that just a little bit?
Well, we see that happen, after Kennedy's assassination when, LBJ becomes president, right? One of the things that John F. Kennedy wouldn't do was build up in Vietnam, right? The
Right.
military industrial complex wanted John F. Kennedy to build up in Vietnam, and he wouldn't. But when Lyndon Baines Johnson comes to power, the United States creates a false flag incident called the Gulf of Tonkin incident
Mm-hmm.
that involves a U.S. ship, right? That was what they used as, sort of the catalyst to get America involved in the Vietnam War in full force. And so that's essentially something similar to what they wanted Kennedy to do in Cuba as a pretext for a
Right.
full scale invasion into the island nation of Cuba. And Kennedy wouldn't have anything to do with it,
Right.
right? After the Bay of Pigs operation, Kennedy signed, and this was just before his assassination. He stripped the Central Intelligence Agency of authority over covert ops, and he placed all covert operations in the hands of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which are answerable to the President of the United States. And so, you have this. John F. Kennedy was a transformational president, right? And there is absolutely no doubt that President Trump is a transformational president.
Well, and there's some other parallels
Mhm.
there. When we look at JFK, wasn't he accused also of being a Russian sympathizer,
Oh,
colluding with
100%.
Russia?
100%. And so what we've seen with Trump is actually sort of identical to what they were doing to John F. K at the time. They didn't have much success with John F. K, which is why they ultimately had to dispose of him by other means. And so, you had them take the position that he was soft, he was weak on communism, right?
Hmm.
And it's the national security state that has been pushing this. Oh, we got to go to war on communism, right? We got to stop them, or they're going to take over the world. Because if Guatemala falls to communism, then Mexico will fall to communism, and then boom, America's going to be a communist nation. And so, they vilify JFK as a communist, right? And so they've done the exact same thing to President Trump, with Russia, as opposed to the
Right.
USSR, because the USSR disbanded in 1991, and since that time they really haven't been a threat really to anybody, as far as I can tell. They've been pretty much minding their own business, right? Except for when the United States overthrew the elected government of Ukraine. That's when they got a little bit uppity and moved into the Ukraine, because we were waging war from the Ukrainian Russian border. But they immediately started to tag Donald Trump as a Russian spy,
Right.
right? And we know now that what was that dossier called?
Oh
The
my
the
gosh. I don't,
Steele
the
Steele
Steele
dossier, right?
dossier.
And we
Yes.
haven't FBI agents gone to prison for lying to courts in order to get search warrants on the basis of a lot of these allegations against Trump. And so they set up this entire fraud not long after the death of, who was that Democratic operative who, Seth Rich,
Hmm.
right? Seth Rich sort of becomes sort of the basis for all of this Russia collusion, right? Because it's believed that Seth Rich, before his assassination, um, gave all of the Democratic Party's emails to WikiLeaks,
Right.
right? And so the Democratic Party's response was to basically say it was Russia, 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 right? And that sort of begins this entire Russia collusion narrative that was taking place. And so they tagged Trump as a Russian asset. We saw his entire first term as president of the United States with people like, that Ukrainian dude. What the hell was the Ukrainian dude's name? Came out and made the whistleblower Vindman, Alexander Vindman. They came out and made all of these claims against Russia or against Trump and his relationship with Russia. They used those as a basis to try to impeach Trump, and none of that worked. Right.
And all of which has since been debunked
Right.
on a very tight
Yeah.
scale. I mean,
Yeah.
it was debunked in Congress. It was debunked even in the media now.
Well, it's funny because, J6 is actually sort of a component of this, what the national security state starts to do.
Hmm.
And so, when you go back to 2016 and Trump's election, the military industrial complex and the military intelligence community and the other agencies like the Central Intelligence Agency had a very bad reaction to Donald Trump, right? And so they began working with Great Britain on programs to censor conservative speech. And that leads to a woman we're going to talk to a little bit about here today. I got to tell you, Donald Trump, President Trump, if this woman still has a security clearance, someone in your administration is sleeping on the fucking job, right? And we're going to talk about Susan Spalding. So,
And we've talked about Suzanne Spalding quite a bit.
Yeah.
And we've put out posts
Yeah.
and social media information. For those of you that don't know, Suzanne Spalding really started off in the CIA. She was a CIA attorney. She's been in Department of Homeland Security. She was in CISA, CISA.
Right.
And so she is the epitome of this military intelligence or military industrial complex we talk about. But we don't really have to explain to you who these people are
Yeah.
because they tell us who they are, don't they,
tell us
Brian?
who they are. They do.
Yeah.
They do. They tell us out in the open who they are. And, but before we go there, I want to take a minute to give a shout out to somebody that is absolutely critical to what we do here at We the People USA Alliance, and that is to Kimberly Burleson.
Yes.
Right. Without Kimberly Burleson and the tireless work that she has done, I mean, if you want, go to the website. Go to the website. You can download the first edition of her report that details Susan Spalding's work in the national security community and how she sought to impact not only our rights to free speech in the United States, but how she sought to impact the judiciary. Right.
Yes.
So I want to say thank you, Kim. You're a godsend. Without you, we would not be anywhere near where we're at today, and we probably wouldn't be having this show on this topic. So thank you very much.
Yes, you are greatly, greatly loved and appreciated. And we can't say how grateful that we are that you are part of the We the People team and how much we appreciate you. So thank you for that, Brian.
Yeah. And so, you want to let Susan Spalding speak for herself?
I think we should. So, Steve, can you go ahead and cue up video 2? And this is Suzanne Spalding herself talking about her background and what she is currently doing.
What I want to talk with you about tonight is the work that I've been doing at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a national security think tank here in Washington, D.C. Since I left the Department of Homeland Security in January of 2017. But it started, my interest in looking at these issues, of course, started when I was at DHS, and particularly in 2016. While I was at DHS, I led the group of men and women who worried about securing our critical infrastructure in this country. And in 2016, that very much included our election infrastructure, as you know. And we were very focused on trying to protect our elections. And what we wound up seeing, we were looking very carefully for and defending against traditional malicious cyber activity. And what we saw was malicious cyber activity that was ultimately used to fuel an information operation and disinformation in that campaign. And when I got out in 2017, I was very mindful of what our intelligence community had told me while I was at DHS and subsequently put in a public report, that what we saw in 2016 from Russia in terms of information operations around the election was really just part of a broader campaign to undermine public trust in democracy and our democratic institutions. And so that is what the work that I began to embark upon at CSIS was looking at what did that mean? I came out of the intelligence community. That's where I spent much of my career. And in the intelligence community, we do something called red teaming, where you try to put yourself in your adversary's mind and figure out what they might do next. So I tried that. I tried putting myself in Putin's mind. And I thought if my goal was to undermine public confidence in democracy and democratic institutions writ large, where would I go next? And I thought about what other institution is like elections, so dependent upon public trust and confidence in the legitimacy of its process for the American public to respect the legitimacy of the outcome. And I'm trained as a lawyer. I went to law school, spent a number of years practicing law, and I immediately thought about our justice system and how dependent it is on public faith and confidence in its independence and impartiality and in its competence. And I thought about how easy it would be really to undermine that confidence.
Well, quite interesting there, right?
Mm-hmm.
She mentions two things there, right? And I've been talking about both of these subjects for a very long time publicly, right? At exceptionally great risk to myself. But what she's talking about are elections and our
Mhm.
court, right? And so, we know that Susan Spalding, um, do you think when they leave the national security state, they ever really leave?
I don't believe they ever do leave.
No, except for what Trump has been doing by stripping them of their security clearances, they keep their security clearances pretty much forever, right? And they keep all of these contacts and ties in the national security state, and a lot of them are back and forth, in and out,
Well, and
in
that's
and
the
out.
key, right? Because they go from a government agency
Right,
and then they'll go into an NGO
right,
or an associated organization like
uh-huh,
an infrastructure
right,
organization. And then they'll take these new appointments. I mean, she's been everywhere from the CIA
right,
to, again, CISA, DHS. She was appointed as counsel to the investigative committee for Congress.
hmm,
So they just bounce around and around. It's the
right,
same players and they
right,
keep sort of resurfacing in other areas. And
hmm.
you're right, they talk about the critical infrastructure, right?
Critical infrastructure.
Critical
Right,
infrastructure. So elections and our judiciary.
right.
And she said something really interesting. They are the two institutions
Hmm.
that are solely dependent on public trust.
100%. 100%. We were talking a little bit about public trust with regards to Maricopa County. Sorry, I like to go off topic every now and then. But Maricopa County just signed a big contract with Runbeck, didn't they? I mean, not Maricopa, but Mojave.
Mojave County.
Right,
Yes.
right. And so they did it to include watermarks on ballots and things of that nature, correct?
Yeah, they put the bid out and they
Right.
claim that they only got 2 bids back and
Hmm.
Runbeck was the better bid. it's more concerning to me that they are now trying to get all 15 counties in Arizona to engage in this contract
Right.
with Runback.
Hmm. And so, what I would, we can't get Runback's records, can we?
No,
No, it's a private corporation. And so we completely lack transparency. What do you think is the best way to fix the perception of our elections in the United States?
well, if you actually want fair, honest
Mm-hmm.
elections, you have to bring forth transparency.
Right.
You have to let the public in. You have
Right.
to open the door and let them see what's behind the doors, right?
Right.
But that's if you are having a fair election
Mm-hmm.
and you want public trust.
Right.
If you need public trust, but it's not fair,
Mm-hmm.
then you need institutions that will build a wall and isolate the
Right.
community as a whole from knowing what's going on.
Right. Okay. And so, I would, what I would do is I would urge these counties, like Mojave, when they negotiate contracts with these third party suppliers, to negotiate in terms that provide for transparency, that say, okay, Runback, if you're going to be our supplier, then you are the repository of public records relating to our election that the people then should have access to. Would you think something like that would be a fair contractual term?
I think it would be an ideal contractual term. I think we would struggle
Mm-hmm.
getting the governments to agree because it sort of defeats the purpose in outsourcing
Right.
the election to a third party contractor
Right.
if that contractor is subject to the same public records. I mean, we've seen
Mm-hmm.
that they've used these vendors in an effort to obscure
Right.
the election process because Brian, you're an attorney. You could probably answer this. If Runback chooses to not provide documents to the people, but those
Mhm.
documents belong to the county
Right.
under their contract, the county could just as easily release that information and have chose not to. Is that
They
correct?
could, yes, that's 100% true. Yeah, because the county would own all those records.
So if the county is the one actually really wanting to obscure the records,
Right.
it wouldn't be in their best interest to negotiate transparency into those contracts.
That's 100% true. So, transparency in elections is the only way to get the monkey off the back. It's the only way to be able to show that our elections are free and fair. But let's go back to Susan Spalding. I want to, can you cue up video 3, Steve? Now, before this video, was that?
Yes.
Yeah. And so before you cue the video, I want people to listen very closely to what she says, because in this video, she is saying who she is and whom she supports. So go ahead.
You're listening to a podcast from the Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation.
So when I got out at noon on January 20th of 2017, and I had an opportunity to be home and watch the cable news all day, which was a big mistake, and watch what was going on the Hill and the conversations that were taking place, I became increasingly frustrated. That the focus was all on the elections, most of it looking backwards, right, which we have to understand what happened. That's a really important activity that's being undertaken. But those who were thinking ahead were thinking about the midterms in 2018 and the next election in 2020. And I was really discouraged that there wasn't a greater recognition that this was not just about elections. This was about, the elections were one aspect of this long-term campaign to undermine a democracy and to weaken us, right? To weaken our alliances, to sow discord and dissension and chaos in this system. And I think, most importantly, to undermine the appeal of democracy, primarily for his own population.
All right. Yeah, that was a mouthful, wasn't it? And so here's what I got from that. If you want to hear my take first, then we can hear your take second.
Yeah.
What I got from that was, um, she is a true believer that Hillary Clinton won the election. She was frustrated that Donald Trump won the election and that was the day he was sworn in, right?
Mhm.
January 20th, 2017, right?
Yes.
She was dismayed by that fact, right? She was frustrated. She says, well, we're going to go back and figure out what happened in this election. She said that, right?
Right.
We're going to go back and figure out what exactly happened. How did my girl Hillary lose? That is exactly what she is saying, right? How did Donald Trump win this election? And she talks about, well, we need to look forward at future elections. We need, and she specifically says, we need to focus on the 2018 midterms and the 2020 general elections, right? What happened? Was there controversy surrounding the 2018 election in Arizona?
Oh, absolutely. We had three
Yeah,
critical races flip
right.
in 2018.
3 critical races. And then was there controversy surrounding the 2020 election in the state of Arizona?
In the state of Arizona and probably about 15 plus other states across the
Right,
country.
right. And so, that's what I take from that. That, oh my God, what happened? How did we lose?
Hmm.
And she essentially is saying, how did we lose? Right? How did we lose? Meaning, how did Hillary, the deep state individual running for the presidency, how did we lose? I
Right.
mean, what do you take from what she said?
Well, I took the same thing, and I also heard in there that they were going to put their focus into
Hmm.
ensuring that they had a better control or grasp over the elections
Right.
moving into 2018 and
Hmm.
2020. And it was sort of shelled as they want to protect the institution
Right.
from the disinformation.
Right.
But in reality, we saw the continued distrust in the elections and the
Uh-huh.
speaking out increase
Right.
in 2018 and 2020. So it wasn't really a protective mechanism of
Right.
the institution as much as it was
Hmm.
controlling the elections.
Yeah. The national security state has, virtually destroyed in the minds of a lot of people what we call our democratic institution, right? Susan Spalding, and those were her own words as she's really disgusted by what happens in 2016. She can't believe it. She can't believe her team lost the election,
Right.
and she indicated that, well, we're gonna focus on the future and make sure this doesn't happen, right? And so that's kind of what they started to do. You wanna watch the video about her talking about red teaming our election?
Yes. Play video 16 if you would, Steve.
But we started, had this Office of Cyber and Infrastructure Analysis, which does this holistic look at consequences, particularly. Look at what should we be worried about? What's the whole gamut of election infrastructure? Let's try to get our arms around that and figure out how this is the risk management approach that we would advise to the private sector and to my colleagues across government, right? Start by assessing your risks and really emphasize consequences. So they came back to me with a nice paper talking about starting with voter registration databases through the formulation of the ballot in state and secretaries of state offices, in the electors' offices, and the loading of those ballots into voting machines and the security around the voting machines, and then the tabulation process and the transfer of those tabulated votes, and then the announcing all the way through to broadcast media announcement of early vote returns, et cetera.
Holy shit. That was a mouthful,
Yeah,
right?
we're going to get involved in all areas. What is the whole
Right.
gamut of the election infrastructure?
Yeah.
She talks about from the voter registration
Uh-huh.
moment, the databases that
Right.
house the
Right.
registrations, to the ballot,
Mm-hmm.
the creation of the ballots, run back,
Run
right?
back. Run back.
To the tabulators
Right.
and the equipment used to process early voting, all the way to
Uh-huh.
the media infrastructure
Right.
to report election results.
Right.
So this is the military industrial
Uh-huh.
complex getting involved in every aspect of our elections from beginning to end.
Every single aspect, right? And that was her own words. And so, just so people know, she was saying all this stuff on a podcast that she was doing with somebody from Stanford University,
Mhm.
right? And Stanford University is widely known to be the University of the Central Intelligence Agency, right? And so, it's the big national security spook institution, and so she has, she's sort of a kindred spirit with
Mhm.
these people. And so, they red teamed, and basically what red teamed means, is you look at ways to undermine a system, right?
Right.
How do you want to attack a system? And they studied every aspect. She even said how ballots are transferred from here to there,
Right.
right? They knew everything about elections in every key swing state. They red teamed everything. And now we've got all of these machines, right? And who do we know is responsible for maintaining security of the machine?
Well, it depends on at what level. I mean, we've got the EAC,
Uh-huh.
right, who's responsible for setting the standards that
Right.
nobody follows, that none of the machines meet. But overall, on a statewide level, it's the
Uh-huh.
Secretary of State.
Right. And at the federal level, there's another entity that was created by Susan Spalding.
Well, that would be
Uh-huh.
the cybersecurity aspect
Right.
of the election equipment. Yes.
Right. The National Security Agency's Cyber Security and Infrastructure Security Agency. It's quite a mouthful, but
Mhm.
they have access to every aspect of our elections
Let me ask you a question,
from a
Brian.
computer point of view.
They wouldn't share the source code with any auditors.
Right.
As a matter of fact, my understanding is most of the election officials don't have the source code to this equipment.
Right.
Do you think CISA might have the source codes to these tabulators?
I would be willing to bet CISA has the source code for the tabulator, right? And so what does CISA do? I mean, CISA probes your systems looking for weaknesses and vulnerabilities, right? They break into your systems and they, try to get into as much as they can get into of your system. That's how they test these systems,
Mm-hmm.
supposedly, right? And so, the big problem with that is, and we've talked a lot before, and maybe what we ought to do is do a separate show on some of the big hacks that have taken place, because they've literally been ingenious hacks where they've hacked into CISA, right?
Right.
And they were able to, with these hacks, sit inside and watch everything that CISA was doing and everything that CISA was probing. And so, as CISA's probing and finding weaknesses, so too are the people who hacked in. It was such an ingenious hack. I think it was our government hacked itself, right? And because the hack, yeah, because the hacks originated from within the United States,
Absolutely.
right?
And, I think it's important to state that one of the things CISA did is it went into a lot of these, not just the states,
Right.
they actually went into the counties
Mhm.
offering help to increase security and decrease vulnerability
Right.
by serving as the cybersecurity arm of the county elections,
Right.
giving them full access into these voter registration systems
100%.
that Suzanne Spalding talked about when she was red teaming,
Right.
right?
They knew everything about our voter registration system. And I think it was, the 2024 primary election here in Maricopa County, and I believe in Pima County, where it was definitively proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that the voter registration records are online, because when there was a hack that brought down, you remember which airline it was? Anybody remember the
It
airline?
brought down more than one. It was actually CrowdStrike
CrowdStrike.
that went down,
Right.
and the CrowdStrike platform
Uh-huh.
is associated with the site books and the e-poll
Right.
books.
Right.
And I don't think it just affected Arizona.
No, it was all over the place, but voter
Mhm.
registration records went down during a primary election,
Right.
right? So when you would go to vote, they wouldn't be able to pull your voter registration information up to determine whether or not you were an eligible voter. And so this is CISA hard at work. Thank you, Susan Spalding. CISA was more about getting into our elections, I think, than actually protecting our elections, right? A lot of this looks like it's, well, we're going to determine the outcomes of the election. We're going to censor your speech, which is where we're going now. And you're just going to, continue being happy, working your 9 to 5 and getting your weekend off so you can mow your lawn and maybe get a day at the lake or something, right?
Well, it's interesting you said that, because I think there's a little bit of a role to be played in an organization like CISA
Uh-huh.
being the cybersecurity agency, because if John Q. Doe,
Uh-huh.
who runs a cybersecurity organization, he may be incredibly qualified, gets hacked while
Right.
servicing voter rolls,
Mm-hmm.
that's going to be a much bigger deal
Right.
than they made it when it's provable that CISA and their association with the voter rolls was hacked in nearly every election since 2016. So there
Right.
was a hack in 2016, there was a hack in 2018,
Mhm.
2020, 2022, and nobody's outraged.
Right.
But had it been some random guy in his
Mhm.
basement who gained access
Right.
to those voter rolls, people would be outraged. So it's almost like it's a
Well,
cover agency.
yeah, and here's sort of the problem with that food for thought. I'm going to try this whiteboard here, right? And so, we run elections at the state level, right? And so let's say, these are states or localities where we run elections. If Joe Bob is doing, he gets hacked down here doing this state's voter registration records, that has an impact on that state, but it doesn't have an impact on every other state.
Right.
When you centralize a processes under the control of one authority, if that authority gets hacked, everybody downstream gets hacked. And that's part of the problem with the federalization of our elections through CISA, right? One guy can get hacked, but this, when CISA's running everything, it can literally change the outcome systemically. We could wind up with a president that people did not want or vote, and that's the problem. Yeah, well, yeah, that state sovereignty issue is a whole nother
Right.
thing. But you wanna do the next video? It's called Disinformation Attack.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. Steve, while you queue up number 11, I just want to say that that's the next phase in it, right? So they
Right.
get in and they muck everything up in the elections,
Mhm.
and it's done in a way that becomes shocking
Right.
to the average citizen, because we're now operating our elections in kind of a black box,
Right.
so to speak. Less
Mhm.
transparency, people don't understand it, it's
Right.
reasonably questionable.
Mhm.
And then we have significant issues in the outcome. So people start asking questions. So
Right.
now we have to create
Mhm.
a narrative that basically calls people like you and I
Right.
crazies or Russian assets
I'm crazy for
if
sure.
we question the election,
Right.
right?
Yeah, yeah, and I'm definitely crazy for sure, but I agree with you 100%, and that's probably maybe a point that we should make even more. Um, I haven't been effective at making this point, but the understandability of our elections for everyday people, right? When people are told, "Oh, this person won," most people, "Oh, okay." And but they don't understand that behind that victory lie 2 million lines of computer code,
Right.
right? Who understands that? Most people understand going to the polls, casting a ballot, and then a group of people at a precinct level counting those up and then phoning the results into the central facility. Most people understand that, right? You can see that's something that is tangible. You can't see this code that's processing as you shove all these ballots into these scanners and it's purportedly tabulated. You cannot see that, and that's what they did with our elections. They made them so we cannot see them, so that we cannot understand them, and then they bring out this whole, oh, you got to trust the expert, right?
Well, and that's the other phase that's really bad. So not only do we have this incredible expanded lack of transparency,
Right.
but we have a system that is intentionally over complicated
Overcomplicated.
to the point where they can say to just about anybody, you're not qualified.
Right.
You don't understand. And the average citizen is going to take that
Right.
and they're going to say, no, no, you're right. I probably don't understand. I've seen these kind of comments
Yeah.
on social media. And the issue with that is they've created, again, a system as well
Right.
where only people that are tapped and approved
Right.
by these officials
Mhm.
even have the opportunity to sign up and become election experts.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, and so they've essentially created an election aristocracy, right?
Yes.
A group of elites responsible for running our elections, and then everyone else can just sit down and shut up, right? You'll trust the results that we give, and so that's a huge problem. But you want to was that right?
Right.
Yeah, right.
You should turn your mic
Yeah,
on when you say stuff like that.
right.
Sorry, I was remembering Reagan. He said the 9 scariest words in the English language, right? It
Mhm.
was Reagan, right?
I believe it was
I-
Reagan.
I'm from the government and I'm
Mhm.
here to help.
Yeah.
They want to take over the entire infrastructure so that we just trust them
Uh-huh.
and take their word for it.
Right.
Because they're policing themselves.
They're the
So we don't
experts.
need to look over their shoulder.
Right. Yeah. Did anybody in here, real quick, know who said the rising tide lifts all boats?
No.
Huh? A lot of people attribute the expression to Reagan, but it was actually John F. Kennedy. So,
Interesting.
and that's another sort of parallel between John F. Kennedy and President Trump. You guys been following the polls on younger people in America and who they support?
Oh, yeah. Overwhelmingly.
Overwhelmingly support Donald Trump by huge numbers, right? And it was the exact same thing for John F. Kennedy, right?
Mhm.
Both men have a great deal of appeal to the younger voters. And so that gives me hope, that gives me faith, that gives me confidence that America is going to continue to have a bright future and we're going to survive this period of time since COVID that our national security state decided to reach a little bit too far. And so you want to, was that?
Yeah. Let's
Yeah,
do
go
it.
ahead. Yeah, disinformation attack.
As Matt Rhodes noted in our recent workshop for state and local election officials, one thing Democrats and Republicans can agree on is that foreign adversaries have no place in our domestic politics. The Defending Digital Democracy Project aims to identify and recommend strategies, tools, and technology to protect the democratic process and systems from cyber and information attacks.
Well, you know, and so this is just more reinforcement about how deeply the national security agencies buried themselves in our local elections, right? She's talking about them training everybody at the local level, right? And what do we know about Maricopa County? They even designated a subject matter expert, didn't they?
Absolutely.
Yeah, Stephen Richer.
Stephen Richer, who
Right.
is now working for States United.
States United, right? And so, do you think Susan Spalding knows the folks from States United?
I would imagine they're in collaboration together.
I would probably support that. We got another video, and I think this is an important video. I think this is just as important as Susan Spalding admitting that she was on a particular team and that they were going to learn what happened in 2016 so they don't repeat it in 2018 and 2020.
Right.
And I think I call this the Susan Spalding admission video. And so maybe though, let's do something different. Let's move that one.
Okay.
I want to move that one. And so let's go to the next segment where Susan Spalding talks about our judiciary, right? Because the judiciary is incredibly important.
So she says we're training local
Uh-huh.
election officials, right,
Yeah.
at the local and state level.
Uh-huh.
So this is admitted that they're training the election officials. And then they move
Right.
on to talk about the robust training they're doing for our judges, right?
Right. Right.
Can you cue up for Steve? Let's put up video for the Supreme Court training
Mhm.
that Suzanne Spalding is doing.
Training for federal judges with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court introducing the subject and talking to them about cybersecurity as a means of making sure they don't have the hack and leak of emails and the disruption of the courts that causes a lack of confidence, but also understanding disinformation, training them.
All right. So what she's talking about is the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yep.
She obviously went to the Chief Justice and pitched a training program on the issue of disinformation, right? What the hell is disinformation?
Well, I mean, but she is a Fed, so
Uh-huh.
she's training federal judges and talking to them about disinformation, but it goes deeper than that even, right?
Well, yeah, but why? I mean, the question is, why is anybody allowed to teach our judiciary the truth? What's the purpose of a court in our society? It's to have advocates
Right.
clash, right? I did a tweet the other day in which I talk about, justice. I love justice, Lady Justice, right?
Who used to be blind, who is no longer blind.
She stands there in a robe with a blindfold, right? Holding these scales. And then the two advocates come before her and they clash and they fill their relevant scale their relevant scale with the evidence. And she weighs the evidence. She doesn't see who the parties are. She doesn't see any of that, right? She just weighs the evidence. And so this is Susan Spalding. We call it, and I think we talked about it a little bit last week, didn't we? Poisoning the well.
Yes,
Right.
absolutely.
This is called poisoning the well, right? When you get the national security state, and this isn't an attack on our judiciary, right? This is an attack on our national security state because all of these people are lawyers
Right.
and they know that if they can do X, they can get a different result
Right.
possibly, right? And so this was an attack on our judiciary by the national security state by training them what the truth was.
Right.
what is true and what is false
In our elections.
in our election.
Because that's really what this is centered around. When they
100%.
talk about the disinformation and these
Right.
various trainings,
Right.
they don't come right out and say that, but we know that based on the training materials
Right.
and the things that we've seen, all the way down to Suzanne Spalding's report about the
Right.
Kremlin, right?
Yep.
She's talking about how Russia interfered with the 2016 election
Uh-huh.
and how they need to prepare the courts for these future attacks. So essentially, what they're doing is they're going in and they're
Uh-huh.
training these judges how to identify arguments put forth by the
Right.
citizens in regards to elections
Right.
that they consider disinformation.
Right. Right. So, if you know what's going to happen in advance in the election, and you can train your judiciary and tell them, oh, people are going to make these arguments, but they're not true, right?
Right.
You're poisoning the well.
Well, that's what I find really interesting, not about this next video, but the next one we're going to share.
Uh-huh.
And we could talk about that. But they actually talk about preemptively
Mhm.
getting these judges to start speaking out
Right.
pre-election lawsuits.
Yeah.
They don't use that exact term, but it's quite interesting.
And that's in what video?
That's in video 6. I think we should go ahead
Okay.
to 6 because you kind of opened that door, and then we can go back to 5.
All right, let's go. Let's play
Let's-
six.
let's go
how
to
how
six,
long is
Steve.
6?
Probably about a minute.
Oh, okay.
Oh, almost 3 minutes long.
Cool.
Okay.
Davey and I wrote a number of papers around restoring trust in our national security institutions. And there again, we talked about the importance of civics education. As we, in the run up to the election of 2020, I became increasingly concerned as I saw what was happening in our courts with the convergence of COVID and our elections and election officials and state officials making decisions about how to carry out an election in a time of COVID, and that those decisions were being challenged in courts. So you take a very inherently divisive and partisan issue, the elections, and an increasingly partisan issue of COVID. You bring those together and you put them in front of the courts at a time when there is this concerted effort, at least coming out of Russia, to undermine public trust in the legitimacy of our courts. And I saw a recipe for disaster, that as the courts ruled on these cases, there would be an inevitable temptation for the losing party to conclude that the court had acted in a way that was political, that was not based on law, but based on the judge's preferred outcome. And we were doing training. What we've been doing over the last 2.5 years, 2 to 3 years, is training federal judges and state judges and their teams on this threat from disinformation, undermining public trust in the courts, and how they can detect it, and the things that they can and must do to restore the public's confidence in our justice system, including higher levels of transparency, making sure that they are clearly explaining their cases and explaining how they are relying on the law, and that much of this needs to be put out early before the case comes to the court. So we are now engaging in this again in the run up to the next rounds of elections, that courts need to be posting right now. How do these election related cases come before them? And how do the courts look at them in a generic sense, not in a specific case? So basic things, what's a preliminary injunction, right? What's a TRO? So that there are authoritative sources to point to, but that they also need to think about having voices in their communities who can talk about and set the record straight if false information is being put out.
That's interesting that, that she said, I think at the very conclusion there, a lot of that stuff, the court's already put out, right?
Right.
You can go to the court website and learn what a TRO is, a temporary restraining order, right? Courts have always had these educational websites. But it's interesting that she said at the very end there that the courts need to have somebody that can come out and speak out on its behalf
In the communities.
in the community.
Right. So they want
right,
advocates
about-
in the communities.
Right, advocates in the community. And so the reason I became a lawyer was because, I just absolutely love, right, this American conception of justice, right, which I just talked about a little bit ago, where you get two advocates pitted against each other on opposing sides. They fill those scales, and justice is whoever puts more of the evidence in the scale, right?
Right.
That's who's supposed to win in our system of government. But the concern I have about people like Susan Spalding and the national security state mucking around in our judiciary, especially for election-related purposes, is that they're poisoning the well. And this is something that I think this was one of the things that Eisenhower, way back in January of 1961, was warning us about, right?
Absolutely.
That we have to be careful that they don't get too much influence over our institutions, right? I mean, the fastest way to destroy legitimacy in government is to have one group of people that's allowed to present expert testimony and evidence to our judges prior to a case being heard, and then making a decision based on that expert testimony and judge it. That does away with this process that we've long had in the United States, where advocates go and do battle before the court and fill those scales, right?
Well, I found it interesting. This video that we just watched occurred in 2021.
Yeah.
Okay. And she talks about training the judges
Mhm.
and their teams for the last 2.5 to 3 years
Right.
to get them ready for this disinformation.
Right.
But in another breath, she said that most of this kind of arose because of her seeing the clash of COVID
Right.
and the elections,
Right.
and how people were challenging how the elections departments were going to run the elections in a COVID world.
Right.
But 3 years prior to 2021, nobody even thought about what COVID was.
Nope.
So they were planning 3 years in advance how to
Mhm.
address this post-COVID
Right.
election world or mid-COVID election
Right.
world we were living in. And that timeline doesn't add up for me.
And what was the date of that video?
That was January of 2021.
January of 2021. So that was, let's see, Donald Trump was sworn in 2016, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that was about the time of J6, right?
Correct.
About the time of J6. So about 4 years after Donald Trump's presidency. So they began, what that tells us is they began educating judges almost immediately after Donald Trump was elected, right? We heard Susan Spalding in her own words say that, well, we need to look at what happened, we need to look at what happened. How did we lose?
Right.
Right? How did the national security team lose?
Right.
And then we need to focus on 2018 and 2020. And boom, we learned that they are educating their training judges.
Well, we
It-
know
but-
it was about 2019 that Suzanne Spalding started really getting active in the state of Arizona.
Oh,
I
yeah.
believe it was about 2019. Steve, can
Yeah.
you play video 5?
Well, hold on. I think
It-
producer Steve has a comment.
I looking at that timeline or thinking about it, it seems like this was a contingency plan that was put together during the Obama presidency
Yeah, could be.
during those years and was implemented immediately after, because all of them, everyone said there's no way that Trump's going to be president. You can
Right.
take that to the bank.
Yeah, that was That was the that was the plan. Trump's not going to win. Trump can't win.
And then
Right.
in the primary, well, about a month after he
Uh-huh.
won the primary in
Right.
2015, they were like, "Holy shit!"
Right.
And then they
Yeah.
started mobilizing, right? And
Right.
that's when the Russia dossier, the Steele
Right.
dossier, and all this
Uh-huh.
stuff started coming out because they're like, "How do we stop this?" Go ahead,
Yeah.
Stephen. Video
Yeah. Now,
5.
basically, real quick, just to sort of preface this, right? Um, Susan Spalding made a very, very concerted attack, not just on the federal judicial system, right, but on state judiciaries as well. And so they went, her and her partner Parker, can never remember what Parker's first name is, but they went to this judicial council, right,
Mhm.
that all state court systems participate in, where they go share information and
Right. It was
whatever.
somewhere in the Midwest or
Yeah.
back east.
Yeah, and so they went, I believe it's the chief administrator for the Arizona Supreme Court went to the conference, and I think it was in 2018 or 2019, when Susan Spalding and Parker were giving a
Right. It
presentation.
was 2018, and
Right.
that was the Kremlin presentation.
Right. And that's when he came back, the chief administrator, Byers, David Byers, I believe it is,
Mhm.
came back to the state of Arizona from that judicial conference, and he pitched what would become known as the Disinformation Task Force
Yeah.
to the Arizona Supreme Court. And so I think Steve wants to add a comment.
So just to clarify, misinformation is false information shared without the intent to deceive. So like if someone says
Oh.
something that they thought was true but it ends up not being true, that's misinformation. Disinformation is intentionally trying to mislead people or manipulate them. So that's the difference.
Okay, well, we're gonna talk about the distinctions a little bit more, not after this video, but after another one with Susan Spalding in her own words. And so, but what we're gonna watch now is this is yeah. Go ahead and play video 5.
Chief Justice, you set up a task force in Arizona, at the Arizona Judiciary, through an administrative order that specifically wanted to address how you could counter disinformation. What were the particular events that triggered that Arizona courts were the targets of disinformation intended to undermine public trust and confidence?
Well, it was really Miss Spalding and Dean Parker.
Right, there you go.
Miss
Yeah.
Spalding and D. Parker.
Miss Spalding and Dee Parker taking their traveling road show into our courts
Right.
around the United States.
So he's
as well.
asking the Chief Justice,
Uh-huh.
what made you believe that there was an attack on the Arizona justice system? Miss Spalding,
Right, Miss Spalding.
she told me so. She told me Russia was coming after me.
Yeah, and here, this is the problem, I have with all of this, right? This is sort of coming out of an era where our federal government has really dominated the United States for a long time. And most government was done by experts, right? I
Mhm.
can't get this damn thing out of my ear. And so most government's done by experts, right? And so you have experts, right, the Chevron doctrine
Right.
was created, right? And so that's essentially how the United States lived for a very long period of time, 30 some years, 40 years, right? Where an expert, the legislature, Congress deferred to agencies of the federal government and said, here, you make rules regarding these issues. We're just going to pass a generic law. You make the rules, fill in the blanks. And then they would also, when they made the rules, they would give their own interpretations of those rules. And the Arizona Supreme Court said, yeah, we're going to defer to your interpretation of those rules, right? And so it became government by expert.
Right.
Government by expert.
Right.
And so this sort of is flowing from that, right? What's the problem if a former spook, if you want to call her that, because she was formerly Central Intelligence Agency, she's been deep in the national security bowels for a very long time,
Decades.
right? She has the highest level security clearances you can get, right? And so when she comes to you and she says, "Hey, Russia gonna fuck with your shit," right? I can't tell you how I know because then I'd have to kill you. But
Right.
trust me, I'm an expert, right? I am steeped in the national security community. We know we're watching Russia and we see it happening.
Well, and we've got Suzanne
Right.
Spalding. She's at the forefront of
Mm-hmm.
pushing this narrative, but she's always accompanied with another expert, right?
Right.
She refers to
Yeah.
Davy and one
Right.
of hers, and then she refers
Uh-huh.
to Dee and this
Right.
one, because it's how they confirm each other. They
Uh-huh.
work together. They come up with this hypothesis
Right.
or this reality
Uh-huh.
that they want you to believe.
Right.
And so it would be like me coming in and saying, "Okay, everybody, here's the scoop. I need you to listen to everything I have to say." And then I've got Brian here, and he's going to tell you that everything I'm saying is right because he read the article I wrote,
Right.
and now he's an expert too.
Right. And so it's just like, you have spy A tells spy B that the color yellow is really green, right?
Right.
Spy B then goes tells one of his, what do you call those people that, give them information?
Informants.
The informants,
Right.
right? Snitches, right? Spy B goes and tells his snitch that the color yellow is really the color green. It's not really green,
Mhm.
right? And then Spy A just happens to bump into Spy B's snitch on the street corner, and the snitch says, "Hey, by the way, did you know the color yellow is really
Really green."
green, right?"
Yep.
And so it's confirmation bias, right? And
Mhm.
so you get that's exactly what they did with this Russia probe. They created a narrative and then used that narrative to prove everything around the narrative. And so
Right.
and so, I'm a big believer in the fact that our judicial system bought probably one of the greatest hoax in the history of man when it created a disinformation task force in Arizona, and when Chief Justice John Roberts allowed for a training program on the issue surrounding deeply, deeply constitutional issues known as First Amendment rights of free speech. Right.
And speaking of free speech,
Mm-hmm.
they talked about the two major critical infrastructures
Mm-hmm.
that are solely dependent on the public's trust in their results, right? They talked
Right.
about the elections. So they've been
Yep.
really, really, really involved in the elections
Uh-huh.
ever since, to their admission, 2016. And I
Right.
would venture to say many years before. I agree
Right.
with Steve. This started to be put into place years before that, possibly during the Obama administration or before. And then we've got the judiciary, right?
Mhm.
Suzanne Spalding basically admits this was her brainchild, understanding how she believed the elections were under attack, that she needed to find out where else are they going to go from here? What's
Right.
next?
Right.
Oh, they're going to come after the judiciary.
Right.
So that's another institution. But in order to really keep this game going, in order to really control the narrative and truly be able to declare and be
Right.
the thought police, right? Because that's what a disinformation task force, in my opinion, is.
Right.
Is it's the Ministry of Truth or the thought police.
100%.
So in order to really do that, you have to also control one other really important aspect of American culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that would be the media.
100%. But before we go there, I want to play Susan Spalding in her own words
Yes.
saying, "Yeah, this is all bullshit." But in the meantime, Steve seems like he has a comment. Steve-O?
No, it's just it's amazing to me. It's like Hollywood couldn't come up with a better script, right? This
Right.
is someone that came from the CIA, came from
Mhm.
three-letter agencies, who's interested in deep government
Mhm.
interests, and is using typical stereotypical CIA tactics, fifth
Right.
generation warfare, gray zone warfare tactics to manipulate the judges ahead of time
Right.
because they know that challenges and lawsuits are going to be filed coming down the road
100%.
because they're going to screw everyone over on the elections and they know people are going to scream foul play.
Uh-huh.
And it's like it was beautiful and poetic that you started out with talking about JFK because this is exactly what he was trying to avoid.
Right. 100%.
Right.
Exactly.
And that's why he was divesting the Central Intelligence Agency of its authority to do covert operations and placing it all with under the Joint Chiefs of Staff so that they were under the direct control of the President of the United States.
Right.
And we haven't. Well, hold on. I want to add something to that. Oh, that would be number 6.
No, it's
No,
not.
I'm
It's
sorry.
number 17.
17. Yeah, and it's going to be it's interesting video because I think it completely, deflates everything Susan Spaulding has done. But the Central Intelligence Agency and the national security state, the military-industrial complex,
Right.
they did things very differently back in the time of JFK because, they were, as Eisenhower said in 61, this coming out of World War II and the Korean War, this is all really new,
Right.
right? We had not had in our entire history this big of a federal government and this monstrosity of a national security state and military industrial complex.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
So it's one of those scenarios where it grew very, very fast out of necessity because of World War II,
Right.
right? And anytime something grows really fast and out
Mhm.
of necessity, there is usually no safeguards,
Right.
no safety net.
Right.
And I think that's really the point that Eisenhower was speaking to in his farewell address
Mhm.
was the fact that we did this.
Mhm.
Now what?
Right.
We have no way to protect
Right.
liberty, freedom, and the American people from this machine we've built.
Right.
Americans, you have to protect yourself from it
Mhm.
by being informed, intelligent, diligent.
By
all of these
listening to
things.
podcasts like this one.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Question
Yeah.
authority. And so, the point I was going to go on to make, though, is that, they learned over time. And so the ultimate irony is this: JFK created USAID, right?
Mhm.
He created USAID to be a peace moving organization that helped underdeveloped countries become developed countries to move their populations out of poverty. USAID was nothing about war, right?
Well, then it became an arm of the CIA.
Right. Well,
The very institution
yeah.
he was trying to protect the American people
Right.
from.
Right.
This institution he built actually
Uh-huh.
was turned over
Right.
to the CIA.
Yeah, and then you look at the entire history of the 70s and the 80s, and it's the United States. We're running around the world staging coup d'etat, right? In
Right.
Chile, what was it, 1972, when we helped General Augusto Pinochet overthrow the Chilean government? You look at our involvement with the Contras against the Sandinistas, and then you look at the fact that Congress said, sorry, no funding for the Contras, and you get people like Oliver North. I've never been a big fan of Oliver North. A lot of people, a lot of conservatives probably bashed me over the head. Oh, you should support Oliver North. He loved his country. Oliver North violated the law, right? He was trading guns and money for drugs and shit,
Mhm.
right? To wage a war that Congress said no.
Right.
And that was against
Not much different than what Hillary Clinton did
no.
as a government agent in running weapons into the Middle East.
Nope, absolutely nothing different than that. But the CIA has learned over time, right?
Yes.
And then you have ultimately their big grand experiment took place in 2014 in a country known as Ukraine, right? And what happened in the Ukraine, they used USAID, the CIA, and the Department of State as a tool to create a whole bunch of social mobilization organizations that they could use to stage what we call a soft coup, to have
Right.
an impact on the government, to bring about new elections, and that then they would interfere and play in those elections and get the candidate elected that they wanted to elect. So the CIA learned a lot in 2014 with what was known as the Maidan Revolution and their involvement in that revolution. And it's long been my belief, at least the basic premise upon which I've been working since 2020, is they implemented that strategy in the United States in 2020 to help them defeat Donald Trump and elect a guy who was nothing really more than a zombie, really, especially his last 2 years.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Real quick before we do go to that video, I just want to share totally not factual, historical, but Hollywood sometimes tells the story,
Right.
right? As if they know what's going on. And we watched a comedy a while ago. It was a Netflix movie called The True Memoirs of an International Spy. And it was interesting because the president of Venezuela had supposedly won his election by fraud. The U.S. funded this fraud election, and the rebels that were trying to assassinate this president were being watched by the American CIA because the president of Venezuela was actually from San Diego. He was an American that the CIA helped rig the election in Venezuela.
Right.
And this is the kind of stuff that USAID gets America into these foreign bodies and
Right.
starts playing in all of these different arenas. And during the movie, the CIA was visiting with the rebel camp.
Right.
They were visiting with the funders and the president.
Right.
The whole time they're puppeteering all of these people and controlling every aspect from
Right.
the outcome of the election to who survives it. And it was a comedy,
Right.
right? But there was a lot of truth to it. Like I was watching it, I'm like, this is really the stuff
Well,
that
and
happens.
and that's Hollywood, right? Hollywood really plays that up. I mean, what young man doesn't want to be a spy when they grow up? Steve, did you want to be a spy when you grew up? Chris, did you want to be a spy when you grow up? It'd be cool, right? No. I mean, you get to shoot people, you get to drive really cool, fancy, flashy cars, you get to sleep with all the best looking women in town. You get to travel the world.
Secret lockers
Yeah.
in foreign countries
Right.
filled with cash.
Yeah,
Right? Who
cash
doesn't
and
want
guns
that?
and alternate passports, right? I mean, yeah, they make it about as sexy as you can make it, right? Yeah, so Chris wanted to be Get Smart. He wanted to be the guy making all the gadgets and gizmos and stuff. And that's it's still similar, you're playing a role in the system. But that's how they portray it.
And almost
And-
normalize it.
Yeah, and,
When
and
you
so
say like,
right, and so we're almost to where you're at with the media, which is really no different than Hollywood. But let's go ahead. Let's play number 17. I want you out there watching this to pay very close attention to what Susan Spalding says, because the entire premise of Susan Spalding's creation of CISA and the intervention in our elections and the entire premise of her going into the federal and state local court systems is what? Russian disinformation, right?
Right.
Russian disinformation.
Putin.
We have to stop Putin. We have to stop Russia. Now, what you're going to watch is her talking to a judge in Maricopa County, Arizona. Maricopa County, Arizona.
Maricopa
I believe
County.
it's a Mesa, Arizona judge. So go ahead, shoot.
With respect to our foreign adversary, particularly Russia, again, what we see is far less development of false information than promotion and amplification of disinformation that originates with Americans in the United States.
Suzanne, how is that logistically done? Are there just like masses of people sitting in their Russian apartments monitoring Facebook and Twitter and and people actually, retweeting or doing whatever? Is it
I'm sorry.
people?
Most of them are sitting together in this building, or at least they were pre-pandemic. Maybe they're all outfitted with laptops at home now.
I'm sorry about the
Well,
laughter,
they're
but
social distancing.
right, right. Yeah,
The Russians are no longer in one basement. They're
Right, they
spreading out.
They're going to the coffee shop. Yeah, sorry about the laughter, but I really appreciate that Mesa City judge because, he didn't seem like he was really buying it,
Right.
right? But what did you hear Susan Spalding say?
Well, now she said that the disinformation is originating here
Right.
and that
She-
Russia is propagating.
Right. So she switches gears, right? She's no longer selling Russia's the bad guy per se. She says Russia is no longer, and the choice of her words is also critical. She's saying that Russia is no longer really generating false information. She say false information or untrue?
Yeah, Steve, I think we should play this
I
again.
think we should play it again.
And we'll mute our mic so we're not laughing through the whole thing. But we need to play it again. This is a big statement.
With respect to our foreign adversary, particularly Russia, again, what we see is far less development of false information than promotion and amplification of disinformation that originates with Americans in the United States.
Suzanne, how is that logistically done? Are there just like masses of people sitting in their Russian apartments monitoring Facebook and Twitter and people actually, retweeting or doing whatever? Is it people?
Most of them are sitting together in this building, or at least they were pre-pandemic. Maybe they're all outfitted with laptops at home now.
All right. And so here,
So they're developing far less disinformation,
no, she said false.
false information.
She said false information, right? So Russia is, well, they're not really doing the false information stuff. They're just amplifying domestic speech. They're amplifying what Americans are saying that Susan Spalding and the national security state consider to be disinformation.
Right.
That's fucking huge, people. Because, was it? You say watch F-bomb? Oh. I'm sorry. This just blows my mind.
Because they're admitting that they're censoring American free speech. See, it was
Right.
okay when the big bad wolf was this foreign adversary.
Uh-huh.
And so as we built in this story, she's saying we can all agree.
Uh-huh.
Democrats and Republicans,
Uh-huh.
Russians there. But we don't want Brian there either.
Oh, no.
We just don't want to tell anybody that.
No, we don't want to. We don't
want to admit
Right.
that.
Right. And so Susan Spalding and her friend Parker, it's all interesting that they launch after, admittedly, right?
Mhm.
She gives a speech in January 2021. We've been educating your judges for three and a half years, right?
2.5, 3 years.
It's-
Mhm.
That starts mid 2017 during the
Mhm.
Trump administration, when we know the national security state began making plans to get rid of Donald Trump, right?
Yep.
And so this was the national security state having a very visceral reaction to somebody who was very much like John McCain, who was going to take them, grab them by the balls, and reign in their power.
Right.
And they don't want that, right? What would happen, do you think, if we were able to find all of their overseas secret bank accounts? We could probably pay off the U.S. national debt,
Oh, I would imagine.
right? And so, the amount of money these people have been stealing us blind for decades, we need to get control of the national security state. And that's why the American people cannot go to sleep. You cannot go to sleep. What year is this?
25.
2025. The 2026 elections are absolutely critical. And Susan Spalding would tell you the same thing. And that's why they're going to be involved in those elections.
They
Because they
know
are
they have
critical.
to hang on to the executive branches of many of these swing states that they control. They need to try and flip the House. They need to flip the Senate, right? They know how important it is to stop
Right.
as much as they can or hold Trump back as much as they can from exposing this institution that they've
Right.
built.
Yeah. And you know what's interesting? There's a guy, Mike Benz. You ever heard of Mike Benz?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think he charges, for you to listen to his good information. We give it to you for free. And I think Mike Benz has completely missed really the depth to which Susan Spalding and her former CIA compatriot Parker dove into our judicial system and into our elections. It's actually incredible, built on a premise that she just admitted in that video to a City of Mesa judge was
Right.
false.
Right.
And so, you want to talk the media, right?
Right. Well, they asked Suzanne Spalding during one
Yeah.
of her interviews. They said, "Well, what role does the media play in this
Oh, I don't know.
this operation that you're running, right? This program. What role does the media play?"
Right.
And so she talks about the role the media plays in this whole process. So,
Uh-huh.
Steve, do you want to play number 7? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, the role of the media is so fundamentally important. And the media, of course, is also being attacked because that's part of the attack on the whole notion of being informed and of any idea of truth. Mike Hayden, who was the former head of NSA, talks about, our movement toward a post-truth world. That's the world that Putin has created in Russia, where his population just shrugs its shoulders at that of course it's all lies, and it's just taken for granted now. They've given up on the idea of truth, and that's where he wants to get us.
They've given up on the idea of truth, right?
Yep.
These people, they need to find a new bad guy, right? I mean, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, they sort of lost their way, and then they get involved in all the anti-terror shit, and they're bringing Russia back because they want the world divided into these two spheres, and that's how they're a convenient
Thank
boogeyman.
you, Steve. That's
Yeah.
what I was kind of waiting
Yeah.
for an opportunity to say is I think it's because Russia makes a really good boogeyman. It's
Yeah.
something Americans can be afraid of without thought or logic,
Right.
right? Even back, you think about Red Dawn when the Russians invaded, right? It was a real easy sell.
Well, yeah, but that was a movie.
That's what I'm saying.
Right.
It was an easy sell
Right.
because people inherently are just
Uh-huh.
like, ooh, Russia.
Russia.
Because this narrative has been
Right.
built since the Cold War
No,
that
no.
one day Russia's
Mm.
going to come for us.
This narrative has been built since World War One,
Right.
when the Bolsheviks took power in Russia, and then ultimately created the Union Soviet Socialist Republics. Right? We didn't like the USSR going into World War II. That's why we let the Nazis chew them up as much as possible
Right.
before we got involved in World War II, so that we could kill two birds with one stone. Right? So we didn't like the USSR. So it's been our boogeyman for a long time.
Right.
But JFK tried to end that conflict, that perpetual state of war. A perpetual state of war is very, very caustic on the human psychic, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're in a perpetual state of conflict, you're going to die early of cancer because you're going to stroke out. Yeah, and so it's time for peace. It's time to get rid of this boogeyman, and it's time to get rid of these people who are obviously using a boogeyman to deny Americans their civil liberties and their civil rights.
Well, but Brian, would the American people support this great overreaching military industrial complex if there wasn't a boogeyman, if there
No.
wasn't a state of perpetual war?
No.
And that's why they have to keep
Right.
that moving.
Right.
It's how they feed themselves, right?
That's how they feed themselves. And that's how they, they have to have war. All right. So do we
Yes.
have a video on me? Did we just play that?
We did. We played it.
Huh.
So what we were going to do is kind of talk about some of the incident reports and the threat reports, but I
Right.
think maybe we hold off on that. And I think we can sort of wrap this up. Did you want to
Well,
wrap it up with these States United players?
yeah, and that was sort of the whole point of the show is that we can't really know where we're at today
Right.
unless we know where we've been, right? And so let's talk about these key players in States United. And just to sort of preface this for our listeners, States United is currently buried in the governor's office, right?
Mhm.
They're calling the shots in the governor's office. They're calling the shots in the Arizona Attorney General's office,
Yes.
right? They're calling the shots in the Secretary of State's office, more likely than not, right? We know that Stephen Richer had them buried deep into Maricopa County elections. I wouldn't be surprised if they have deep ties to Runbeck. We don't know yet, do we, if they have deep ties to the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors?
We don't yet at this point because they
Right.
have not responded
Right. Yeah.
to
So
our
we're
public
trying to
record.
we're trying to get that information. So we'll update you as soon as we get it. But States United has burrowed into the state of Arizona, one of the swing states that they have to be able to hold and keep if they want any chance to retake power. And so, who is States United? Let's take a look at them.
All right, let's do it. So you want to
Oh.
go ahead and expand that slide. So this is
Yeah, man, you got an old
slide
dude
8,
here, and I can't see shit.
and slide 8 is their leadership team.
Okay.
So it's the president and chief executive officer, right? Chief executive officer. So this is the main operating agency. Joanne Lidgate, Christine Soon, Lizzie Ulmer, Jen Fogel. These are all players that if you go and look them up, most of them come from very, very radical administrations
Uh-huh.
underneath secretaries of states, governors, attorney
Right.
generals, and many of them, including Christine Soon, are attorneys themselves.
Right.
But I think the advisory board
Oh yeah.
is the one that really, really stands out. Steve, can you put up slide 9? Now, this is one page of 2 pages of their advisory board. And if you look at some of these players,
Michael Chertoff. Didn't he recently learn his security clearance?
yes,
Yeah, he was the he was the head of the NSA, wasn't he? The National
Mhm.
Security Agency under, was it Obama?
yes,
And then he was head of security for the U.S. Supreme Court. I believe at the time, that Susan Spalding was conducting judicial training, but definitely at the same time that the Supreme Court's abortion decision was leaked prior to the 2024
Right.
election.
and that's
right?
when the justices
Yeah.
started getting attacked, and
Right.
they had
Right.
the
And that was-
protesters on their lawns.
Yeah, and that leak was a distinct effort to try to influence the outcome of our election, right? So who do you know on there that national security agency related?
Now we've got William Crystal. We've talked about him in a
Mhm.
previous podcast. Big time funder in Defend Democracy, Democracy Now, all of these kind of Republican funded democracy movements
Right.
that have a far left leaning kind of
Yeah.
culture within them, right?
Right.
And then we've got Janet Napolitano.
Oh.
right? Straight
from
out of
Arizona, isn't she?
Arizona. Yep. She was a former governor of Arizona. And then she was appointed as Secretary of Homeland Security
Mm-hmm.
under the Obama administration and left Arizona as the governor.
Right.
And she's still a really big player out there. And
she
then,
probably has a security clearance and probably still tied into the National Security Agency.
well, and it's interesting you say that because you had talked about that
Uh-huh.
before. How many of these people get these security clearances
Mm-hmm.
and then they just have them forever?
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of them.
What is that process for revoking that security clearance, right?
I'm a big fan of you leave a national security agency, you leave without a security
Right.
clearance. Right. But that's not the way our security clearance system works. Was that?
Not until we point out one last one.
Yeah, probably the smallest man on there would be Stephen Richer.
Yes. Former
But-
Maricopa County Elections
Right,
Recorder,
right.
Stephen Richer, bottom right-hand corner. Him
Yeah.
and William Crystal are two of the most recent additions to States United.
Yeah, and they're brought on board to make it appear bipartisan. But in last week's show, we talked about sort of, American politics is in this transformational period, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where the parties are undergoing this realignment, right?
Right.
This adjustment. And it would appear that the Republican Party is now becoming the dominant party. These people like Stephen Richer, these leftist Republicans are now joining into associations with people whom they have more in common, right? The
Right,
left,
and we kind
the
of talked
radical
about
left,
that. This is
normalizing.
the realignment of like the institutionalists
Right.
versus the constitutionalists,
Right.
right?
Yeah, 100%.
So you have constitutionalists,
Mhm.
I'm sure, somewhere on the
Mhm.
Democrat side, right? And you have quite a few institutionalists on the Republican and the Democrat side.
Mhm.
So they're coalescing under this idea of, do we prop
Right.
up the institution, the military industrial complex,
Mhm.
this whole system that feeds the machine that
Right.
we've built?
Mhm.
Or do we prop up the Constitution, freedoms, individual liberties,
Right.
all the things that Eisenhower
Mhm.
warned us to protect
Right.
from the military industrial complex?
Right. And it's the institutionalists like Stephen Richer and Bill Kristol, that support maintaining the status quo. And it's funny, Stephen Richer doesn't really care about your constitutional rights. He doesn't think you should be able to speak freely about elections.
Right.
He wants you to sit down and shut up and simply trust the experts.
Right.
And so, Stephen Richer joining the bandwagon of this national security group of people in States United does nothing in my mind really to help them. But it just shows the people of Maricopa County, Arizona, and the United States that these teams are starting to choose up, right? Like
Right.
when you used to play dodgeball in school,
Right.
you would try to get everybody all the good players to sign on to your team before
Right.
the other team got them.
It's like an
that's what's
organization
happening.
of elitists.
Right.
They're pulling together all the elitists, the people that are proven battle warriors, right? I mean,
Right.
if you are truly
Mhm.
anti-election integrity movement,
Right.
then there would be no better spokesperson than Stephen Richer, who was
No doubt about
attacked
it.
by the election integrity movement, by
No
the
doubt
election
about it.
deniers, right? He's the poster child
Uh-huh.
for their movement.
Yes. Yeah,
He truly is.
100%. And we'll actually go there the next show because
Ooh.
we've left off. We're going to talk about threats, violence, and
Yeah.
other ways that they have attempted to unduly influence our institutions, including the institution of the judiciary. But
Put
go
up
ahead.
slide 10 though, Steve. Let's just finish off there's a whole nother half page at least of people on the advisory board here. And we've got Tom Ridge, former governor of Pennsylvania, right? We've got, interestingly enough, Sarah Saldana, former director of immigration and customs enforcement, right?
Uh-huh.
former Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, Michael Steele, and then a United States Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama. Right? These are governors, former governors, sheriffs.
Kim Wyman, former Secretary of State for the state of Washington,
Right.
right? Christine Todd Whitman, former governor of New Jersey. I remember her, which I guess shows how old I am.
Right.
But all of these folks, have one thing in common. You know what that is?
Other than they're all part of States United?
Yep.
Go ahead.
They hate Donald Trump. That's the one thing that unites them.
Yes.
And that's why last week on the show I said we've got two political parties. We have a political party of people that hates Donald Trump, and we have a political party that supports Donald Trump.
Right.
And that is how America breaks down in a bipartisan way nowadays. So when they talk about bipartisan, right? States United is a bipartisan group of people who all hate and loathe Donald Trump.
Right.
And they have one mission. And that one mission is to destroy Donald Trump and to destroy MAGA.
Well, what's interesting is that movement that kind of began in 2015, right? We talked about how that came about around the primaries of 2015. It transcended beyond 2020. So in 2020, they claimed they beat him. They claimed they beat Donald Trump in the elections and they put Biden in as president.
Right.
And you would think at that point, they would at least believe they had a reprieve.
Right.
But it never stopped. The battle between the America First MAGA and the people who hate Trump
Right.
continued all the way up and through the 2024 election. So there was never any reprieve or break from this philosophy, which, what does that tell you, Brian? Does that tell you that it's about the movement, or it's actually a new way that we're dividing as Americans in general?
Yeah. Well, it's not only that, but they were very active. Susan Spalding was very active in our institutions, as we've seen her talk tonight. And what we're going to talk about in the future is how Stephen Richer, members of the DOJ, may have been very heavily involved in some of our institutions, other than the ones they belong to, in an effort to, this was a basic effort to criminalize, I believe, a political party, to criminalize MAGA. They worked so hard to demonize MAGA to make us appear to be a violent group of extremists, right? They were actually educating judges on extremism in America. Now,
Right.
if I were a criminal defense attorney, and I know what I've learned in my research and this investigation we've been conducting, I would be screaming from the rafters, right? And so you have this was an all out push. J6 was part of
Absolutely.
the setup.
And it's like you said, it's creating a culture. If you're in a community and you commit a crime and
Yeah.
it's very, very publicized,
Right.
and they've tried you in the court of public opinion,
Right.
they move you to another jurisdiction, right? Because you can't get a fair trial.
Right.
But when the MAGA America First movement, to the level that it has been demonized, not only in this country, but globally, you're kind of in a situation where you can't get a fair trial.
Yeah. Well, and we call that poisoning the well.
Yes.
Right. And that's why, Alex Colladon has been a very vocal opponent of poisoning the well. And he, I'm trying to find what the bill was, but he was the only attorney who voted against
The
this bill.
ACJC.
Yeah, against the bill to
Yeah.
fund or support the ACJC, and so the last I heard is the bill is SB 1227, and it's I believe in Bullock's committee, and it has not cleared the rules committee, and so he wants support from the grassroots to try to get that bill killed, because it's in part, an issue of poisoning the well, right?
Right.
Involving, executive action with judicial action and whatnot. And so, he wants people to call, Bullock and keep it buried in rules and not
Well,
let it out.
and we need this, right? Because we don't really want people like David Byers, who we
Right.
saw in that video earlier,
Right.
who started this disinformation task force. He's actually the chair of the ACJC,
Right.
which helps develop policy
Mm-hmm.
and helps train in advocacy and judiciary on Arizona criminal justice.
Right.
So this is them getting involved in the criminal justice system,
Right.
which kind of goes back to the whole due process, poisoning the well. Do we want our federal tax dollars and grant money covering agencies that are involving themselves in matters of the court where, as
Right.
you had said, justice should be blind, right? You have two
Right.
parties, they show up,
Yeah.
they argue their case,
Mm-hmm.
and it's prejudicial.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. Yeah. Well, I mean, we're going to save the rest for our next show, right?
Yes.
Oh,
All right.
yeah. Cool. Should
Well-
be interesting. Yeah. So sleep on what we've told you. I mean, I think what we've shown you in Susan Spalding's own words is that she has worked very hard to scam America on behalf of the national security state, and to interject the national security state very deeply in your elections, and to deny you your rights as an American citizen. She admitted it.
Right.
Well, it's not really Russian speech. No,
It's domestic information
Right.
coming from
right.
American citizens.
Yeah. And so, what else do you have?
Well, I agree with Brian. I just take this in, and I know it's a long podcast, but I hope you really take some time to watch this and dissect it and really understand the state of where we are and heed the warning that Eisenhower gave us to protect our institutions, protect the citizens from this military industrial complex who is trying to overtake all of the critical infrastructure
Right.
in America. And the only way we're going to do it is us citizens need to be informed. We need to educate ourselves. We need to listen to podcasts. We need to gather information, go to public sourcing. And they tell you who they are. Start looking up these people.
Yeah.
They will tell you who they are.
Mm-hmm.
And hear it from their own words. You don't have to hear it from Brian's mouth or my mouth or Steve's mouth or anyone else's. You will hear it from their mouth.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly what they intend to do because they will tell you.
Right. Yeah.
So have a very happy Cinco de Mayo if you're watching it tonight.
Oh, wow. It's Cinco de Mayo.
It's Cinco de Mayo.
Mm.
Yes, it is.
Well, if I drank, I'd have a Corona, but I don't. So I hope whoever's out there listening that is drinking has a Corona on my behalf. And with that, I'm going to say peace.